I hope everybody's keeping warm this morning. Welcome to yet another session on transformation. And today's topic is on the draft Employment Equity Regulations of 2023. We have the pleasure of Fatima Vawda from 27four's to take us through this contentious issue, and I hope you all enjoy. We will take questions at the end of the session, so I will hand over to you, Fatima.
Thank you so much, Lerato, for the very warm welcome, and thank you to all the participants who have joined the session today. We're going to spend about half an hour going through some of the key components of the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, so I'm going to get straight into it. All right. So, in fact, the Employment Equity Amendment Act is not in draft form. It has been signed by the President. And today we're going to be talking about the implications of the Act on the financial services sector in particular, bearing in mind that the Employment Equity Amendment Act impacts all sectors in the economy. Now, the response to the recently published targets, which are in draft form, so the Act was signed by the President into law, but the targets were published for comment recently by the Minister of Employment and Labour, and these targets have generated a wide range of reactions, and you can see from the screen. There's been quite a bit of upheaval in the industry as well as in the broader economy. Some participants have outright rejected the targets, considering them a form of racial engineering, while others have presented arguments for potential improvements. In fact, while I was preparing for the session last night, I went onto social media and found a lot of activity around the Employment Equity Amendment Act from various industry organizations, NPOs, political parties. There are fund campaigns that have been set up, and in effect, majority of those organizations are defying the targets that have been published. So, given the type of reactions we've received in response to these targets, we put together a research team and we attempted to ask some pertinent questions like the four listed on the screen at the moment. To what extent has the economy progressed in terms of transformation? Is further government intervention actually necessary? We do have the financial sector codes. So why is the sector opposing these targets so aggressively? And when we look at these targets, are they even achievable? So we put a study together to examine these draft proposed employment equity targets for our sector within the framework of the sector's performance against the management control element under the Financial Sector Code, because essentially these targets are, if we have to consider the closest comparison to these targets, it would be the management control element under the Financial Sector Code. We also look at where did these targets come from, because we do have concerns around the integrity of the data in validating these targets. We also deal with skills shortages within our sector, as well as the capacity of the state to enforce this legislation, and the private sector's apprehension towards potentially sizable fines and penalties that they may incur. But what our findings have suggested is that whilst there has been some improvement since the dawn of democracy, this pace of change has been incredibly slow, and based on simple assumptions and calculations that our quants team conducted, based on the professional demographic in our sector and economic growth expectations, it would take roughly 170 years to achieve the type of racial parity in top management positions that we currently require based on the Employment Equity Amendment Act. So if we just look at those type of figures, we believe that there is a need for government to play a more active and assertive role in promoting employment equity. However, is relying on these numerical targets enough to bring the type of economic growth and inclusive economic growth that will enable our economy and South Africa to break free from the constraints of high unemployment and high inequality. So we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, where did all of this originate from? So going back to the starting point when South Africa's first democratic government, led by President Nelson Mandela, assumed office in 1994, we inherited an economy that was distorted, unequal, and inefficient due to generations of colonialism and decades of apartheid. These institutional frameworks denied the majority of South Africans access to the economy, perpetuating discrimination based on race, on gender, on disability, and the colonial and apartheid economic system ultimately resulted in extreme levels of inequality in both the labor force and ownership of resources of the economy. The skewed structure lacked efficiency and equity, but also hindered growth and development and posed a serious threat to the stability of the new democracy. Considering all the circumstances at the time, the post-apartheid state needed to effectively address these historical inequalities within some form of a constitutional framework and to protect property rights and prevent lots of outflows from investment into the economy. So there were lots of proposals at the time that were put forward, ranging from nationalization to embracing a mixed economy or fully liberalizing all aspects of the economy. And following extensive consultations, the government at the time opted for two regulatory mechanisms to address redress, transformation, and equality. And those are on the screen at the moment, which is the Employment Equity Act and the Black Economic Empowerment Act. The Employment Equity Act was the first equality legislation passed by the Democratic Legislature. Its purpose is to promote equal opportunity and fair treatment by eliminating unfair discrimination and implementing affirmative action measures to ensure equitable representation in all occupational categories and levels in the workforce. This act, different from financial sector codes and the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act, is actually enforced through labor inspectors who are authorized to issue compliance orders to employers for non-compliance. This act also incentivizes employers by making compliance a requirement for transacting with any organ of the state. Then in 2003, we had the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment come into play with the aim of increasing the participation of Black people in the economy. Under the BBBE Act, the Minister of Trade and Industry has the authority to issue codes of good practice regarding Black economic empowerment through the gazetting of the code. And basically, this allows enterprises to be evaluated against a BBBE scorecard that we're all familiar with, that has multiple elements such as ownership, management control, skills development, etc. However, different to the Employment Equity Act, it incentivizes enterprises to comply by requiring every organ of state to consider the BE status of enterprises when granting licenses, concessions, preferential procurement, and entering into any kind of partnerships with the private sector. Amendments made to both of these acts were basically done to improve the effectiveness of the legislation in achieving its goals. Now, if we move on to the Employment Equity Amendment Act, which is what we are here to talk about today, on 14th of April 2023, a couple of months ago, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed this act into law. So it's not in draft form, it's an actual law. And the main purpose of this act is to increase the pace of economic transformation and implement a form of co-regulation by empowering the Minister of Employment and Labour to set numerical targets for key economic sectors. It also specifies the conditions for issuing certificates of compliance, which include meeting the numerical targets, among other elements. So if you look at the screen at the moment, the proposed national targets for the financial and insurance sector is up on the screen. And you can see that the focus is on 4 key areas: top management, senior management, professionally qualified, skilled. And it's broken down by gender as well as in terms of race, and then summarized the total Black exposure within each of the different categories. It's important to note that small employers, regardless of the annual turnover, have been removed from this definition of designated employer to meet the requirements of the Employment Equity Amendment Act if they employ fewer than 50 employees. So if you're a company in our sector, so most boutique asset management firms, most financial advisory firms, consultants, etc., in general employ less than 50 people. And so these numerical targets would not apply to companies that employ fewer than 50 people. So who it really impacts is the larger diversified financial services companies, as well as, of course, the target is largely for the banks and the life insurers. But it's important to note that the minister on his own does not possess absolute discretion in setting these targets and can only establish such targets after consulting extensively with the sector. These proposed targets must be published for public comment, which they were recently done, and they must be reviewed and considered. All the comments must be considered by the minister. And these checks and balances have been put in place to ensure that rights against employees and employers are protected by any kind of irrational decisions made by the minister. So a month after our president signed the act into law, on May the 12th, the Minister of Employment and Labour basically published these targets that you see on the screen. However, what the industry is saying and what a lot of legal professionals within the sector have argued that these targets are premature as they were not formulated through the consultative process prescribed in the Employment Equity Amendment Act, and therefore they should be invalid. What we also see is that there is some form of gender discrimination. If you look at the targets set for men, they're much higher than those set for women. Just for example, if you look at African male, set at 26.1%, but for African female, they set at 18.5% in total, and for top management. And for skilled individuals, you've got more women than men, but for top management and senior positions, as well as professionally qualified positions, you've got more men than women. Also, some of the numbers do not totally add up to 100. And there are a couple of other issues associated with these targets in relation to the data that the department used to compile these targets. And that's an important point, because if we look at the the policy instruments like the Triple B Act and the Employment Equity Amendment Act to evaluate the impact that these instruments have made on the sector to meet their intended goals. We need to have good data of very, very high quality. And what we have found through our study conducted is that the different pools of data that exist in South Africa can be very confusing, and particularly for the financial services sector. And I'll give you some examples. So for instance, the Commission of Employment Equity did not provide disaggregated data by economic sector in the first 10 years after the Act was published. It only began to provide data by sector in 2009 and 10. And also it combined finance and business activities. Then in 2019, it changed its sector classification and grouped finance and insurance together. Also, the Commission for Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment provided little aggregated data on employment from 2005 to 2013. Also, it didn't provide across all the management categories. And this situation is further complicated by the different categorization of industries by Stats South Africa. For example, financial intermediation, insurance, and real estate are grouped together to represent the finance industry. Also, the three SETAs in our sector, the bank SETA, facet, and in-SETA, use different categories for industry and occupational levels compared to those used by the Employment Equity and the BE Commission, the Triple BE Commissions. So based on the available data and looking at all of this data across the sector and the categorization of the data, it's very, very difficult to understand the effectiveness and the efficiency of the Employment Equity Act and to conduct a comparative analysis to understand its contribution to equality and stability. What we also found is that there are limited studies that rigorously evaluate the effectiveness of these policy instruments across the board. And we haven't seen any real academic theories that have been developed by academic practitioners within universities or governments that have provided tools to actually model the impact of the Employment Equity Act. So there are challenges and questions regarding the data and how these numbers came about. Now, one of the big issues that we have is that under the Triple B Act, if you are non-compliant, you don't get issued with a fine. However, if we look at Schedule 1 of the Employment Equity Act, it lists fines for non-compliance to the numerical targets. And the fines are based on some form of a sliding scale, based on previous contraventions by the same employee. And this basically, if you in contravention of meeting the proposed employment equity targets, you could be fined a substantial portion of your annual turnover. So if you look at, for example, just the last row there, it's the greater of 2.7 million or 10% of the employer's turnover. So if you look at a bank or an insurance company, that could in fact go into the billions of rands. And those organizations and companies need to keep huge amounts of capital adequacy reserves to back their licenses against risk products that they've also sold to the market, which includes clients' money that are embedded within those reserves. And so if they are fined on turnover, it could potentially negatively impact not only the business itself, but also the stability of the financial sector, given the impact that it could have on the reserves of these companies. So if one has to ask the question, why is there such an uproar in the sector? I would say that it's largely related to the fines associated with non-compliance of meeting these numerical targets. So what we then did was we said, okay, what is the story here? Let's actually look at the financial sector code and plug the draft EE targets against the management control element of the financial sector code. And what we found was very, very interesting. So first of all, the financial sector has got around 18,000 companies, made up of around 18 banks, 148 insurance companies, around 5,000 retirement funds, although not all of them active, around 900 asset management firms, and around 11,000 intermediaries. We also know that the financial sector has its own BBB code called the Financial Sector Code. The last iteration of it was gazetted in 2017. Basically, what's put up on the right-hand side is the targets for generic enterprises who earn more than 50 million rands in turnover per annum. And what you see there is that to make sense of these numerical targets, even though one could argue that the occupational levels are not directly comparable, but they are ultimately very, very close. What is clearly evident in the table on the screen is that the draft targets set by the Minister of Employment and Labour for the financial sector, in fact, is lower than those targets of the Financial Sector Code. So, for example, if you look at other executive management, top management, you'll see that the FSC targets are 60%, whereas the draft EE targets are 51.3%. And if you keep on going down and you compare the two columns, you'll see that the draft employment equity targets for the sector that's been published by the minister are much lower than those of the Financial Sector Code targets. So it really then begs the question as to why the financial sector is really opposed to these targets. And it really comes down to the management control element. So what you see on the screen at the moment is the management control element. This is from the Financial Sector Transformation Council's 2020 to 21 a report, which indicates that all the sectors in the financial services sector are underperforming on the management control element. So banks are way below the target of 20. In fact, the life officers have only reached 10.86, short-term insurers 10.23, asset managers 12.03, and other institutions 9.32. So in fact, all the industries have been a little bit, they've in fact being delinquent in respect of the management control element. And this has been one of the key motivating arguments behind the establishment of the employment equity targets as well. So we normally come under a lot of, should I say, the financial services sector as identified by the recently published Sanlam Transformation Gauge. And in fact, they use the words that the financial services sector always is in the transformation crosshairs of the public. So this is actually published directly from the Sanlam Transformation Gauge, which again shows that the industry has seen no progress in management control in 3 years. So that's 2021, 2022, 2023, underperforming all of the other elements when it comes to management control, still sitting at 61. And in fact, what was quite interesting is we've made no progress on skills development. We're still underperforming. We're actually underperforming. We've made progress on Black ownership. And in fact, what is really works very well for the industry, because you can write a check to achieve that element on socioeconomic development, as well as enterprise and supply development. We've actually underperformed from 2022 to 2023. And in fact, the Sanlam Gauge report talks about the fact that all three elements, skills development and management control, and the other element has not been met. And if you look at both the BASA and the CISA reports, also indicate that the sector continues to underperform when it comes to management control. And in fact, I found it quite interesting, a comment made by the Banking Association in the Sanlam Gauge survey, which spoke about the stagnation in the economy and the problems relating to skills shortages, which is something that we've also picked up in our analysis and report that we've done. And across the board, there are a number of challenges that contribute basically to these components. If we delve even deeper and we look at the demographic profile of employees across the 4 employment levels for which the Minister of Employment and Labour has proposed these draft targets in the financial insurance sector, even though I must point out the Commission for EE and the Minister of Employment do not differentiate between the individual subsectors, what this picture on the screen shows you is that it highlights the slow pace of transformation within the financial insurance sector, particularly in top management positions. And as I said earlier, based on our analysis, with very little economic growth, it will take around 170 years to meet the current targets set by the Department of Employment Equity and set by the department to meet those targets, because we cannot generate the necessary levels of job creation given our poor economic growth. And so, unfortunately, considering the numerous challenges that we are facing, meeting these targets would be exceedingly difficult, if not near impossible. In general, there are limited opportunities for top management positions, and affecting change in the demographic profile would require significant growth in the financial services sector. I'm going to wrap up by just summarizing in about 2 minutes, and then I'll hand back over to Lerato just on some of our concluding items that we've identified. So what we have found is that if we look at this critical skills list published by the Department of Home Affairs, what they've identified is that skills such as actuarial skills, investment management skills, investment advisors, economists are listed on those critical skills list. Our sector does demand very, very high level skills. However, also given the rapid changes in technology, operations, compliance, governance, business models, product demands, consumer behavior, climate change, we need different types of skills in the sector. We need more data scientists. We need more blockchain developers. We need more behavioral economists, expertise in artificial intelligence, ESG, cybersecurity. And those are the skills that we are struggling to find within the sector. And furthermore, the remote working conditions from the pandemic have created really attractive investment opportunities for South Africans to seek employment outside of the country. What we've also witnessed, particularly in the Black asset managers space and the boutique asset managers space, is that the shortage of very high-level skills has resulted in a war for talent, very, very high, intense competition for qualified African and female candidates in what we call a very unequal playing field. Smaller enterprises are facing huge challenges in competing with larger banks and life insurers and asset managers when it comes to remuneration packages. And the current shortages in skills have also led to short-term responses such as poaching and job hopping, which we know can lead to a lot of unintended consequences for people, as well as the industry and the sector as a whole. Individuals engage in job hopping to pursue higher salary packages, while enterprises poach skilled employees from other companies at the expense of smaller enterprises that have invested in skills and have a real genuine commitment towards transformation. And individuals, in the end, these short-term strategies have very bad consequences on the sector, because you land up with a lot of individuals that have priced themselves in the market, and however the depth of experience and knowledge that employers are seeking is often not there. So these negative consequences have created a war for talent, and effectively in the long term will create a lose-lose situation for the sector as a whole. Now, to summarize our findings, we asked 4 questions at the beginning. We began by asking how far has the economy transformed? The bottom line is, and the concise answer to this question is, that the pace of economic transformation has been insufficient to fulfill the aspirations of the majority of South Africans. The second question is whether more government intervention is required. It's undeniable when we look at the numbers that government intervention is necessary. However, that comes with a big caveat. If we look at the uneven performance of the state, the weaknesses in the state's capacity to deliver, the state failures requires an establishment of a professional public service and a capable state. And these measures, if we don't get them, we won't be able to foster an inclusive economy that enables full participation by everyone in the economy. In terms of establishing the numerical targets, the data indicates that the private sector, and I think the private sector, we need to own this. We need to own the fact that we've been sluggish in enforcing compliance with our own targets on management control in the financial sector code. And so given that the minister's targets are lower than those established, it shouldn't have a drastic impact. We shouldn't be scared by these targets if we have been meeting the code's targets. However, the slow pace of transformation has not sufficiently contributed towards the required number of skilled professionals across all the demographic groups. And what we do have in South Africa is the underperformance of the post-schooling sector in producing the necessary skills, which makes meeting these targets also very, very difficult. Now, if I have to summarize it in what our team have identified, is that ultimately the strong opposition by some participants in the financial sector towards these targets is largely attributed to the legally binding and potential fines of the Act for non-compliance, whereas, as I said earlier, the codes and the BBB Act does not fine companies if they are non-compliant. So we left with a final sentence on my side, and the final question is, what further action should we take? I think we have a fantastic world-class infrastructure in the financial services sector, but we need to identify ways and innovative approaches to deliver affordable services to all South Africans. We need to invest and cultivate a pool of professional and skilled employees so that we can create that pathway to top management positions. We also need to prioritize investments in developing skills, new types of skills, not old type of skills that the industry needs, by collaborating with academic institutions. And we need to do this very, very urgently to build resilience against external threats that we're all facing, such as climate change, geopolitical risks, cybercrime, if we are to attain and maintain our resilience as a stable sector that reaches its objectives and goals to serve all South Africans. So back to you, Lerato. That's a wrap, and I'm happy to take questions that any of the participants may have.
Thank you very much, Fatima. That was rather interesting and an eye-opener. I truly wonder if we'll ever get this right in our lifetime. There are two questions. The first one is from Rowan Williams, and please allow me to read this just to give context. He says, Clarence Thomas, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, and Thomas Sowell, economist, are both African Americans, and they say that affirmative action and similar acts of race-based charity and race-based social support are the cause of inequality and poverty in the demographic groups they are trying to help. What keeps the targeted racial groups oppressed and unable to stand on their own feet? They also say that in no country ever has affirmative action worked and achieved the desired outcome. If affirmative action is exacerbating inequality and impeding economic growth and has never worked anywhere, then shouldn't we challenge the legislation on humanitarian and constitutional grounds? If not, then aren't we just saying that certain demographics cannot compete on a meritocratic basis and must be given special privileges? Fatima, do you want to try and answer that?
Sure. So I've been following what's happening in the US quite closely. As you know, a lot of the developed markets have, over the past couple of years and in the last decade, we've had Trump come in on the US. We've got DeSantis in Florida, and we've got a very right-wing Supreme Court in the US that's actually been all kinds of things, LGBTQ. They've had a crisis when it comes to abortion as well. And affirmative action is basically one of the new targets of that, I would say, probably more right-winged kind of biases that have plagued the United States recently, as well as some other countries across the developed world. We've seen the immigration crisis in France recently. We've seen blurrings by the likes of Nigel Farage, and all these elements have come up in various parts of the world, largely related to the immigration crisis as well that some of those countries face. So I'm not too surprised by those comments. However, if you go back, and the reason why I went back in history and talked about Nelson Mandela's government in 1994 and the reasons behind putting in play some of these regulations was to deal with the inefficient allocation of resources. Black people in this country owned no economic resources. We didn't own land. We didn't own any kind of part of the private economy, and so private sector economy. And so mechanisms needed to be put in place to advance those aspirations and goals and objectives. Again, I come back to, if I have to speak about myself as both a Black person and a woman in the sector, not a day goes by where I don't think about how difficult it is on a daily basis to break through the sector and the industry. And if it was not for Black economic empowerment, I would have stood zero opportunity within the sector. And I very much believe that till today, that regardless of your skills, regardless of your talent, someone like myself would not have risen to where I have, because those opportunities would not have been made available. I think the problem that we have, and I spoke about it extensively, is the quality of the data to measure impact. If we look at smaller components and we break them up, we do find that impact has been achieved. I mean, our annual Economics Transformation in Asset Management survey that we publish, has demonstrated that over the 15-year period within asset management, we've seen enormous growth and transformation success. However, if we have to consider the sector as a whole, as well as other key economic sectors, the quality of the data is not as good as the data that we've consistently put together. It's largely because of the challenges that we face in terms of the definitions and who's including what data, etc. So I think it's an unfair point to make, one, to compare us to the United States. I think we need to consider our own social issues and look at it in a very different way. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Fatima. He goes on to ask the next question. If affirmative action has never worked anywhere, then isn't it probable that this is a political gimmick tactic to win votes, whilst really just causing economic stagnation and reduced capital investment, thereby causing the problem we are trying to address? Over to you, Fatima.
Yeah, so I think it's a double-barrel question. So the first point is we're not shying away from the fact that the state has been inefficient. The state has failed the majority of South Africans. The state has failed us across the board, from healthcare to education. But we need to separate that from creating equal opportunities post 400 years of colonialism. So I think it's and when you say things like it has failed everywhere else in the world, did everywhere else in the world have an apartheid state that clearly discriminated against people from participating fairly in the economy? So you need to separate the failure and inadequacy of the state from good regulations and legislations. And I think that is where the challenge lies. In fact, we've got first world legislation. I mean, if we just look our legislation, or if we look at things like King 4 and good corporate governance, that originated from South Africa, yet we have governance issues across the board. We've had state capture, all of those things. So it's not about the law, it's about the capacity of government to implement and execute, and government has failed us.
Another question from Kanyisila Malebe. Is the value add of women in the financial services industry well recognized, and are women put in top management position due to their value add, or is female inclusion yet another tick box exercise for compliance? Fatima?
It's a huge issue. I mean, if you look at the recent report that was published by Eskom Pension and Provident Fund a couple of weeks ago, that was both a qualitative and a quantitative assessment of the industry. I mean, the findings were really startling. The participation of women in the sector is really a very sad state. There are no clear pathways within the private sector of women advancing towards top management positions. I mean, one of the big things that we always say and that we find is that if leadership of a company is all men, those men will not find a reason for hiring women. But as soon as you have more women leadership, you'll find a multiplier effect, because women will hire more women. So no, it continues to be a massive problem that needs to be recognized. Yes, partially it is a tick box exercise, but there are no very clear pathways for women to progress. What our survey has shown us year in and year out is that you find the equal amount of graduates joining a financial services company, an equal 50 women, 50 men, but women do not progress fast enough, but men get to the top. But yet the same number of the gender demographic started within an organization. And it really comes down to those pathways that we talk about, but also creating some form of equality at top management level. Thanks, Lorato.
Just taking the last question from Rowan, again, Rowan Williams. How do you know the transformation wouldn't have happened anyway without the quotas? Can we prove that causal connection between the two?
Absolutely. I mean, we still experience discrimination on a daily basis, Rowan. It's very, very difficult. And ownership of resources and ownership of wealth and ownership of privilege is very, very hard to give away for anyone. And to be able to share that is very, very difficult. And if you're Black, you've experienced it. If you're a woman, you've experienced misogyny. If you someone that fits within those kind of demographics, you have experienced it.
We have a question from Dumisile Mokoena. Bianca, are we able to unmute him?
Yes, Dumisile, please go ahead and pose your question, please. You can unmute yourself. Dumisile is still there? Okay, looks like we've lost her.
Whilst he's unmuting himself, can I go on to the next question from Jenny Jafter? It seems like the sectoral targets have not realistically taken the backlog we have in terms of skills development. The inefficiencies in the school system and the realities of certain sectors be more dominant in terms of a particular gender historically. How do organizations influence this? Because it seems as if the Department of Labor is tone deaf to any representation made to date.
Yeah, I think I spoke to some of those challenges. And we are having huge challenges we're not getting bang for our buck. If we look at how much of our national fiscal budget is going towards healthcare and education, particularly education, it's more than a lot of the rest of the world. Yet we're not getting we're not getting the success that we should be getting. And those are important questions that we need to deal with. We're also having huge challenges at our tertiary institutions. They are not performing at the level that they were performing previously. And overall, it really points to the incapacity of the state to deliver. And therefore, one of the criticisms that has erupted around the Act is that, under normal conditions, if we had a state that demonstrated success, we would be fine with these targets and meeting the compliance of these targets. But unfortunately, we're not in that position. An incapacitated state pushing more regulations on businesses that are now spending a huge amount of capital and revenue to meet constant compliance, red tape, and regulations without, getting the level of economic growth because of poor policy interventions by the state is a problem. And these are the hard questions the electorate needs to have with the state and address these issues.
Thanks, Fatima. Dumisile, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, I'm going to go on to the last question from Kathy Pillay. Has ASITAs assist in the skills development or there is a dislocate? How do we address this? Do you want me to repeat that? Has ASITAs assist in the skills development or is there a dislocate? How do we address this?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with the success of the CETAs. And I think the person asking the question is talking about FACET and the INCETAs within our sector. I haven't looked at the stats in relation to their success. So unfortunately, I'm unable to answer whether the CETAs have been successful.
Thank you very much, Fatima, for an informative session. I truly enjoyed that. I know the rest of the participants have enjoyed it too. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for indulging us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lorato. Thank you for everyone for making the time. It's fantastic. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.